As we continue our overview of the way that you can use studio equipment to create different musical dynamics, we have evolved to here.
As previously discussed, panning is mapped out visually as a function of left to right. The big question is, what kind of musical dynamics can you create with the placement of pan pots on the mixer? If we think of the space between the speakers as a palette, and the sounds are the colors that we place on the palette, then panning can be based on crowd control. You might want some sounds to be panned as far from each other as possible in order to create clarity. Such a dynamic might be appropriate for certain types of music like acoustic jazz, folk music, and bluegrass. On the other hand, sounds may be panned such that they overlap in order to create a wall of sound, making the mix seem more cohesive. This is commonly done in heavy metal, alternative rock, and new age music. However, panning is often done based on certain traditions that have developed over the years, defining the norm for panning particular instruments. Also, particular styles of music have developed their own traditions for the placement of particular instruments left to right in the stereo field. In fact, it is almost like if you follow these traditions, you create a dynamic that is transparent and lets the music through more. Whereas if you don't follow these traditions, you create a dynamic that might call attention to itself. This is not to say that it's wrong to pan things differently than normal, but you should just be aware of the fact that you're doing it. It could actually be totally cool and appropriate and could change the world. As with fader volumes, some styles of music have stricter rules than others. For example, you can practically do whatever you want in hip-hop, whereas in big band music, it's important to set up your panning the way a big band would normally set up on stage. Acoustic jazz is also sometimes panned just the way the band would be on stage. An engineer will sometimes even place the musicians in the studio as if they were on stage. I've mixed some folk bands just exactly the way that they were standing out in the studio. Doing this helps you to create the illusion that you are there with the band, which can be a nice illusion. In order to obtain the most natural panning of a drum set, try this. First, pan the overhead mics on the drums completely left and right, like this. Then, listen for the left-right placement of each drum in this stereo overhead mix. Pan the mic of each individual drum to exactly where you hear it in the overhead mix. For example, listen to where the hi-hat seems to be in the overhead mix and place the hi-hat mic right there. Same with the toms. Listen to where each one seems to be in the overhead mix and place each tom accordingly. This will give you the clearest imaging you can obtain. You see, if the toms are here in the overhead mix, and then you place the tom mic themselves over here, it's like you have panned the toms in stereo. If you place the tom mic right where they are in the overhead mix, voila, precise imaging of the toms in one place. However, these days, it's quite a bit more common to not pan the instruments as they are on stage. More and more people will pan them to wherever they sound the coolest. It's interesting to note the way that drums have been panned throughout the history of recording. The Beatles placed the vocals in one speaker and the rest of the band in another.
Although this was a mistake, they meant for 2 tracks to be mixed down to mono when the record was made, but the mastering engineer decided to be creative.
Many jazz groups have placed the entire drum set in one speaker. The advantage of doing this is that it leaves a huge amount of space between the speakers for the rest of the band. The big disadvantage is that the separation between individual pieces of the drum set becomes obscured. Now let's take a look at traditions in panning of particular instruments. Individual instruments have come to be commonly placed in specific positions from mix to mix. For example, it's rare that the kick drum is ever placed anywhere except in the middle. It isn't necessarily wrong to place it somewhere else, but it has become commonly accepted to be placed in the middle. This could be because a kick drum appears as a very large sound in the world of imaging.
The kick drum has so much energy it completely commands our attention.
Also, when the sound is in the middle between the speakers, you have two speakers carrying the sound instead of one. Therefore, especially with big sounds like a kick drum or a bass guitar, the speakers don't have to work as hard, so it'll sound better.
The snare drum is most commonly placed in the middle. Some engineers do place it a bit off to the side, especially in jazz, because the snare drum is off to one side in a real drum set. The hi-hat is often placed off to one side also. It seems that most engineers will place the hi-hat halfway between the middle and the left side, like this. However, if you are creating a mix that is meant to be more spatial, it might be appropriate to pan the hi-hat all the way to one side. Now, in house music and hip-hop, not only can the hi-hat be panned anywhere, it is commonly moving during the entire mix and is sometimes recorded with a delay on it. In order to provide maximum fun, tom-toms are commonly spread completely left to right. However, for natural panning, the rack toms are sometimes placed in the middle, just like on a real drum set. A floor tom is normally placed on the far right. However, occasionally the floor tom will get placed in the center for the same reason we normally put kick drums and bass guitars in the middle, because they are so powerful and command so much attention, and because it will sound better when both speakers are carrying the sound. The discussion of tom placement brings up an interesting question. Should the toms be panned from left to right, as if from the drummer's perspective, or from right to left, from the audience's perspective? It seems that those who do live sound commonly pan from right to left, just like in a live show. However, many engineers pan from left to right, just like we read. The other interesting thing is that a lot of people have very strong feelings about this issue. Bass guitar is most commonly placed in the middle as it commands so much attention. Jazz and similar types of music oftentimes place the bass off to one side. This is normally only done when the sound of the bass itself is thinner or the bass EQ has been rolled off, making the sound thinner.
It's poetry in motion.
Lead vocals are overwhelmingly placed smack dab in the middle. If they are recorded in stereo, doubled, sung twice, or made into stereo with an effect, the stereo effect is normally spread evenly left to right. A solo piano is almost always panned completely left and right in stereo, just because it sounds so nice that way. Magical. If the mix is too busy already, that is, if there are a whole lot of instruments in the mix, sometimes it's still panned in stereo. Sometimes it is panned in mono when the mix is really busy. The left-right placement is completely dependent on the placement of the rest of the sounds in the mix when in mono. Again, you can do whatever you want with individual instrument sounds, depending on the style of music. This is just to let you know what is commonly done because a lot of people want their mixes to sound like what is on the radio. Any placement of individual instruments other than the above norms might be considered unusual, but it also just might be considered inappropriate. Besides individual placement of sounds between the speakers, even more important are the overall patterns you can create by panning in the overall mix.
So, wir are now here.
With panning, you can create a symmetrical mix, or asymmetrical type mix. Symmetrical mixes might commonly be created for a love song or ballad. It might be created for a song about balanced ecology of mind, whereas an asymmetrical mix might be created for a song about psychotic, unbalanced behavior. Commonly, symmetrical mixes are used to create a balanced type of dynamic, whereas an asymmetrical mix creates a bit of tension. To get even more detailed, a balanced mix is often made to be symmetrical at each frequency range. For example, if a hi-hat is on the left, a shaker or acoustic guitar might be placed on the other side to balance the high frequency range. A guitar on the left might balance a mid-range keyboard on the right. Again, this is if you're going for a symmetrical mix. Creating balanced or lopsided mixes can be an especially effective dynamic when it is appropriate for the song. Movement of a sound from left to right during a mix also will create a very intense dynamic, so most engineers normally save such drastic creativity for special occasions. There are a number of ways that a sound can be moved this way, creating innumerable patterns of movement. Possibilities range from short, minuscule moves to full range and wide sweeping moves that go the full sweep from speaker to speaker, from pans that move slowly to pans that zoom back and forth between the speakers. Obviously, when it's appropriate for the song, this can be a great effect. Hendrix did it a lot, especially in crosstown traffic. Led Zeppelin went bananas in Whole Lotta Love.